Welcome, everyone, to our fourth lecture in a series of discussions on Black history during Black History Month. And we've had some really good speakers up to this point, and I'm sure that there will be no exception with our speaker tonight. Before I get into our speaker, some recognitions. We have some members of City Council with us. We have Diana Janey, we have Krista Hodges, we have Steve Hazlett, Charles Smallwood. We have a member of the Beckley City Council, Bullock, right here. We have former Senator Bill Laird. And some special thanks to some people. Mrs. Kaufman back here doing the live stream. Aaron Reed, the coordinator of economic development for Oak Hill, who's been working so hard all along this whole month. Mrs. Thelma Walker for handing out programs tonight. She's over here. And Rhonda Falk, who works at City Hall, runs this off, designs it, does this program. She's done a beautiful job for the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks now. So thanks to all those people. And I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it once again. This is a project of the City of Oak Hill, sponsored by the Oak Hill City Council, which has shown unanimous support for the idea, as well as unanimous support for funding. So to the City Council of Oak Hill, a special thanks as well for helping with this idea. And it's also a special shout out to the Reverend Dr. Kenneth Krimmel right here at the Oak Hill United Methodist Church, who has promoted it in his church virtually every week, urging people to show up, take part, listen, or watch it on live stream. Reverend Krimmel has been a real help in this whole project during the last month. Comes down to the introduction of our speaker. I'm not going to introduce him. He has a really good friend who has been out with him on doing a great many activities throughout the Kanawha Valley and through much of West Virginia. His really good friend, an Oak Hill resident, Bill Sahanage, will do the introduction.
Thank you, Danny. I think what we have here tonight is a collection of people that are all here for similar reasons, and some may be different, but maybe a key link is you are all lovers of history and in general, and maybe Black history specifically, and maybe you just love your community and want to support your community. But that love of history, I look around and we have scholars of history, we have professors of history. We have people that seemingly live and die off a 600-page Taylor Caldwell biographies of MLK. That for them is their dream weekend. And those lovers of history stand in a fashion beside, but next to a maker of history. And Reverend Matthew Watts, who was born in Mount Hope, has been making history since he was a high school student, where he was the leading scorer and holds all basketball records in West Virginia for most points in a game. He then went on to Tech, where he was also a leading scorer at Tech, and he lettered there for 4 years in basketball. But more importantly, he graduated #1 in his class in mechanical engineering, and that is not a small feat. He proceeded to practice engineering for many years, and his wife frequently says she married a man she thought was going to be a very successful 6-figure mechanical engineer, that in the middle of his life decided, I'm going to become a pastor and forsake those 6-figure salaries. And so his wife will suggest it was a bait and switch. She ended up with a church mouse. But I like to say that I have few friends that I believe really make historical difference in this world. I'm lucky to have one. In this room, I have a couple. But the one that I'm referring to tonight, Reverend Watts, I'd like you to consider that he has written legislation. He is the only non-legislature in West Virginia that has written, got sponsored, and passed 5 individual pieces of legislation in our state. And that's in and of itself, that a layman can do such a thing, is incredible. But I could speak about Reverend Watts and what he does and what he has been, and how he ministers in churches, and how he is the expert on workforce for our state. For a dozen years, as Senator Laird sat in our state capitol, Reverend Watts came and gave the state of workforce West Virginia and presented to the Senate and the House. Why? Because he's the expert. Juvenile justice in West Virginia, he's the expert. When it comes to felony reentry issues and working with the prison population, he is literally the expert. He is called in on all these issues to basically share with everyone else what's going on in the real world. So I promised Danny I would make this very brief, and I am going to end it with a paraphrase. And for anyone else, this would be sacrilegious, perhaps, or at least hyperbolic. But I'm going to quote and alter Reverend Martin Luther King's a quote, and because it applies directly to Matthew Watts. He chose to identify with the underprivileged. He chose to give his life for the hungry. He chose to give his life for those who have been left out of the sunlight of all opportunity. That is the way his life is going and has gone. If it has meant suffering, and it has meant great suffering, and I've stood by his side while it has, he does not care. He goes on. If it has meant dying for those issues, I think he would very easily give up his life for all of us. He's gone that way because early he heard a voice that said, do something for others. And he's always done that. Proud of this guy, proud to have him as a Fayette County born and raised resident. And he never leaves Mount Hope. Every church he's involved in and every nonprofit he organizes, he sticks that word hope right in there, because Mount Hope is what made him who he is. And I'm so proud to have Matthew here to speak with us. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And it's always a great joy in my heart to be anywhere near my home, my beloved Mount Hope, West Virginia. So we appreciate Mayor Danny Wright extending me the invitation to come up here this evening. And after such a impressive introduction by my good friend, my dear friend, and my brother, Bill Sahanich, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. I didn't really recognize the fellow he was talking about, but he exaggerated just a little bit, I think, a little bit of hyperbole, but I don't think you can have a better friend than Bill Sahanich. And I consider a great joy and an honor to call he and both Senator Bill Laird my friends. And so Bill and I talk quite a bit, always trying to scheme and see what we can do to make West Virginia just a better place for as many people as we can, particularly the least, the last, the lost, the left out, the left behind, and the marginalized. It's become a greater, greater challenge today with all the things that's happening in our country and all the things that's happening in our state. And I tell people often, one of my great civil rights heroes, some that many of you would not even recognize the name, was Medgar Evers. And Medgar Evers was the field secretary for the Jackson, Mississippi Hinds County NAACP. And after being a hero in the war, he came back home and found that things in Mississippi were as bad as they were when he had left. The segregation, the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, White Citizens Council, and his wife, Murray Lee, she begged him over and over again, Medgar, just let it go. Just let it go. And just leave Mississippi. Let's just leave Mississippi. Let's go to North like many of the family members had done. And Murray Lee ever says that she said that Medgar said to Murray Lee, I don't know if I'm going to heaven or hell, he would say, but I'm going from Jackson, Mississippi. I'm not going to be run out of my own home state, my own hometown. And, you know, tragic story, he was assassinated in his driveway one night after returning from an NAACP meeting. He was shot down. His wife and his children went out there and watched him transition to eternity. But for 50 years, his wife, Murray Lee Evers, for 50 years, she kept coming back to Jackson, Mississippi, asking him to reopen the case because she wanted justice for her husband, justice for her husband. And she'd come back and finally got the prosecutor willing to at least look into the case. And he said to her, Miss Evers, why don't you just leave it alone? She said, if you would say that, that's why I told Megan, why don't you just leave it alone? And he wouldn't let it alone, and I'm not gonna let it alone. So you know the story. The case was reopened. The gentleman that killed Medgar Evers was tried for the third time and convicted 50 years after the assassination. So I think that was a fitting tribute to her persistence, her determination, her resolve to see justice roll down like mighty waters and righteousness like ever-flowing stream. So I come this evening, I want to talk a little about the struggles and the pain of being Black in West Virginia. Struggles and the pain of being Black in West Virginia. And for me, my 66 years, it's been a struggle and it's been painful. And it's gotten more painful in these latter years. And if someone told me when I was a child that things would not be much better 60 years later, I wouldn't believe them. Because I live with a tremendous sense of hope and optimism that things would improve and that things would be better. But I'm an optimistic person, but I'm also a realist. And for Black people in West Virginia, I think things are worse than they were when I was a child. And I'm going to tell you why I believe that this evening, that I think things are actually worse. And I do not see anything on the horizon to even think that things might get better. But just like Medgar Evers, I think I'm going to heaven. And I plan on leaving from West Virginia. I don't plan on leaving this state. Had many opportunities to leave in my previous career. And if I have my choice, I hope I leave from Mount Hope. But I tell people often, all these years I've traveled under false pretenses. So every time I come back near Mount Hope, I get the record straight. I'm not from Mount Hope. I thought I was. And I said that I was from Mount Hope. I did not realize that we lived across the railroad tracks and we lived on McDonald Hill. And I wonder why my mother had to go to the post office to get our mail. The mailman wouldn't deliver it. And the trash people wouldn't cross the tracks to pick up our trash. And the police wouldn't come across the railroad tracks to chase after villains to investigate crimes. I wondered why. We're not in Mount Hope. McDonald Hill's not incorporated. So now I tell people I was born and raised in the suburbs of Mount Hope, right? Just to get it straight. I don't want to bring no reproach to the great city of Mount Hope. And then they adopted me and we had up to go to school there. So I appreciate Mount Hope lending me the name of that great city as my hometown. And my journey, I think, is like a journey of a lot of African Americans in Southern West Virginia. I'm an amateur historian. I hated history when I was in school. But then when I became a minister, I realized the Bible really is just about history, right? It's about the history of the nation of Israel, the history of the nations they had conflict with. It's really about history. So now I've fallen in love with history. So I consider myself an amateur historian, particularly of American history. And there's some interesting tidbits about West Virginia history. And I think it's fitting that we are having these conversations now. As you know better than I, the West Virginia is the only state that was born during the Civil War. And so the Civil War broke out in 1861 when Fort Sumter, South Carolina was shot upon, that the people in the western part of Virginia decided that they would not remain a part of the Virginia Commonwealth. But it was a split decision. Most people don't realize that. Maybe 1 or 2 votes between do we stay with the Virginia Commonwealth or do we leave the Virginia Commonwealth? But they believed they had the votes. They decided they would sever themselves from the Virginia Commonwealth. The first Constitution that was submitted to President Abraham Lincoln and the United States Union Congress basically stated that Blacks would not be allowed to live in the state of West Virginia. A lot of people don't know that. They decided we're not going to deal with the Negro question. And so we just soon may not be here at all. The great John Brown, a freedom fighter, if you're on my side of the fence, terrorist if you're on the other side of the fence, when they led John Brown to the gallows to hang him in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, John Brown basically said, you're going to hang me today, but you still have to deal with the Negro question. And many of us believe that John Brown's attempt to take over the munitions plant there in Harper's Ferry was really the beginning of the Civil War, actually. And of course, the war was formally in effect just a few years later. But so West Virginia petitions President of Congress to become a state, 35th state of the Union. Submit this in the Constitution. Lincoln sends it back, and that's not going to work. Not only must you allow Blacks to live in West Virginia, you got to state that you're going to set them free, which most people don't realize. As part of Virginia Commonwealth, the western part of Virginia had slaves. At the time of the Civil War, there was about 21,000 Black people that was in what's called West Virginia today. Over 18,000 of them were slaves. And so West Virginia was the only state that was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free slavery as we were taught in school. It was a proclamation. Lincoln is using his War Powers Act authority. And by presidential fiat, he says all of the slaves in the parts of the country that succeeded from the Union. So those states that succeeded from the Union, he declared that you're now free. Those states that did not succeed from the Union, their slaves were not free. So what Lincoln in essence was doing was trying to break the back of the economy of the succeeding Confederate states by saying to the slaves, if you escape and come to the North, we will not apply the fugitive slave law. In other words, we will return you back into slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. It just gave the slaves that were in the slaveholding states the right to leave their plantations and not remain in subjugation. And the Union side of this splendid nation would not enforce the fugitive slave law. That's the important thing to remember and understand. It was only the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution that was ratified in 1865 that actually abolished slavery. And Lincoln was pressing hard to get the 13th Amendment passed because he was afraid that the Supreme Court would rule that the Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional. So he feared that if the war ended and then if an amendment to the Constitution was not passed, that the Southern states, in effect, could reinstitute slavery. And that's why they cut all type of deals, bribes, stuff illegal to get the votes necessary to get the 13th Amendment to the Constitution passed and ratified so that the Southern states could not reinstitute slavery. But they did reinstitute slavery immediately after the Reconstruction ended, the Great Compromise, to give the North the presidency, pull out the federal troops, and the Southern states immediately started to try to push back as much as possible, 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. Slavery was reintroduced as convict leasing, where the criminal justice system was used. And they would arrest African-American men for charges as minor as vagrancy, and they would lock them up. then they would sell their conviction to a private concern, to a private country that worked them harder than slavery because they did not have the investment of having purchased them. And they would also have the chain gangs, the work crews that we're familiar with. Most of us don't realize that slavery was literally reinstituted. Douglas Blackman wrote a book about it entitled Slavery by Another Name, where he chronicles that this institution was reestablished in the South, and it went on into 1941 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. And Roosevelt was deliberating whether or not the United States would enter the war after Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he met with all of his cabinet folk, and he says, okay, we're going to enter the war as this, on this high moral plane, that we're fighting evil fascists of Germany and Hitler and the Empire of Japan. Is there anything that could embarrass us internationally? And when his cabinet members raised his hand and said, Mr. President, they're still practicing slavery in the South. He explained to him it's basically as barbaric and as inhumane as slavery. And it was Roosevelt that then took the initiative to abolish the institution, what's called convict leasing. A careful reading of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which few of us do, will point out that slavery is still legal. If you read the 13th Amendment, in my opinion, may be the most carefully crafted 43 sentence construction in the history of the United States of America. It is so delicately crafted. So what it does in a marvelous economy of words, it eliminates the private practice of slavery. It authorizes slavery to be used by the government. And it gives the government the authority to pass laws to maintain the institution as long as slavery has been practiced by the government. Google your phone, you'll see. It talks about neither slavery nor indentured servitude is allowed in the United States or its territories, except for punishment of a crime when the person has been duly convicted. So anytime someone is arrested and convicted of a crime, they literally can become a slave of the state. And many of their constitutional rights are revoked. And some of them are permanently revoked, like the right to bear arms, the right to serve on a jury, permanently revoked for the lifetime unless that conviction basically is set aside. And others of those rights are temporarily suspended, like the right to vote in the state of West Virginia until one has discharged their sentence and no longer under correctional control. And so these are tidbits of history that's really important because West Virginia comes to the Union around this abolishment of slavery and end of the Civil War, et cetera. Doesn't want Black people to come in. Lincoln won't allow that, so it's kind of modified. So we come in as the 20th state in the Union, 35th state, of the Union on the June the 20th, 1863, and now the wheel starts to turn. When the Civil War ends, most Black people leave here because they cannot see no future in this mountainous place. They see no place for them. The work is very hard. They own no land. If you don't own any property, how do you survive in a place like West Virginia back in the 1860s? So they left. And there were a few Black people in West Virginia from 1865 until about 1890. As a matter of fact, it's hard to find Black people in West Virginia today that can trace their ancestry back just to West Virginia because there's so few that stayed. But in 1890, something happened. They finally figured out how to get to those thick, rich, bituminous coal seams in southern West Virginia. There now was enough technology to dig this coal out. The railroad is coming through, and now you can get the coal out of southern West Virginia, and now the boom is in southern West Virginia. And so what do you need? You need labor. And where's the labor? It's in the South, these ex-slaves and these children of these ex-slaves. So as aggressively as WVU and Marshall goes to the South now to get talent in the skilled positions, as they call them, the coal operators do the same thing. They put their recruiters on the trains and sent them to the South with fistful of one-way train tickets back to West Virginia, promising these men careers where they would work alongside whites, they'd be paid the same wage, they'd have somewhere to live. And life in the South was pretty barbaric at that time. Several black men were being hung every day somewhere in the South. Ku Klux Klan was running unchecked. And so many African Americans took them up on that offer. Not only did they go to the South, they went to Western Europe and they found as many people there and promised them a house and a job. And many of them came into West Virginia, particularly in the southern part of the state. And so they bring all these coal miners from different parts of the state. They segregate them racially and ethnically, because at the same time, the big push was to organize the Southern West Virginia coal fields. The Southern West Virginia coal fields was only major coal fields in the country at the time, did not have unions. And the operators felt like if they could keep the unions out of the Southern West Virginia coal fields, then they could break the union or at least limit its power in other places. And so the union organizers felt like this was the last frontier and it had to be dealt with. And so if you have not done so, I would encourage you to watch two incredible documentaries. One was done, I think Marshall University took the lead role on it. And the title of it is Even the Heavens Wept. And it's the West Virginia version of the mine wars, or what happened in Southern West Virginia. The greatest armed insurrection in this country since the Civil War, when the coal miners were fed up with the brutality, with the police state that they were living under, the lives being controlled and dominated by the coal operators. They basically were subjected to was almost indentured servitude in terms of they were locked into these unincorporated coal camps where there was no law enforcement outside of any city limits. And the Baldwin Phelps thugs from Bluefield, they came in as the heavy hands to keep the coal miners under control. The latest documentary, which is a multi-million-dollar production, is The Mine Wars on PBS. I think it was done by, I think it was American Experience. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. You can't be a West Virginian if you don't watch it. You won't even understand West Virginia, really, unless you watch The Mine Wars. You understand how our state was just exploited under the auspices of the politicians. And they allowed the entrepreneurs from out of town to buy up all the mineral rights to the land, send the coal operators in, and basically to oppress our people. And this story needs to be told because most people don't even realize how bad that it was. It was as bad as slavery, what happened in those Southern West Virginia coal fields in terms of the way those people were treated. Violated every law that could be violated. The state of West Virginia at the time had a law. There was no United States Labor Department. There were no laws that limit the child labor. Boys could go into the mines legally in West Virginia at age 12. And in many cases, in the Southern West Virginia coal field, they were going at age 9. And many of them were being killed and maimed and hauled, even as boys. And that's a whole nother story that hadn't been told, the number of young boys that died in mining accidents during that time. The 1890 was the pivotal period because that's when all these blacks were recruited coming from the South. And that's why even to this day, probably 65% of all black people in the state still live in the Southern West Virginia coal fields. Fayette, Raleigh, Mercer, McDowell, Mingo, Cabell, Kenora, basically still to this day. And at one time, it was a much larger population than that. But that's a historical picture you don't really kind of understand unless you understand why blacks settled there. And then as time progressed, as automation and mechanization began to take over, and as there was a need for fewer coal miners, then you had another great migration. The first great migration was blacks leaving the South, going north and going west, and West Virginia being one of the destinations. And the reason West Virginia was so attractive to black men in the South, 3 main reasons. One, they were guaranteed employment in which they would make the same wage as their white counterpart, 40 cents a ton. And a ton was a long ton. They even cheated with load 2,200 pounds to get 40 cents a ton. Secondly, West Virginia, by state constitution, made compulsory education the right of every citizen. So by state constitution, West Virginia said we will provide every child a thorough, free, and efficient education for at least 12 years. That wasn't the case in the South. Black kids in the South normally only went to school about 6 years, and it wasn't all year round because they had to be out in the spring early to prepare the land to plant the crop, and they had to be out to get the crops harvested. And so they were not guaranteed education, the full 12 years as West Virginia promised. And West Virginia said, even though education will be segregated in the state, that there would have to be if there were, I think, 20 kids in a community, then they were required to provide a segregated school so those children be educated. That was the second reason. The third reason was that West Virginia, unlike the deep southern states, never practiced voter suppression. There was no poll taxes, no literacy tests. West Virginia never tried to keep Black people from voting, never in its history. As a matter of fact, Waitman T. Wiley was a Caucasian senator who spoke very eloquently on the Senate floor in 1870, pushing for the 15th Amendment to be passed, and lobbied heavily in the state that it be ratified because he said the Negro deserved the right to vote. It's really ironic, and I had this conversation with Joe Manchin III, and I consider him to be a friend. I totally disagreed with him on his position regarding voting rights, and here's why. And this is what I said to him, is that we have a history that we protected the franchise. That was one thing that distinguished us from the deep southern states, that we never tried to keep people from voting, particularly Black people. And so here we are at this nexus in history that little old West Virginia, backwater West Virginia, poor West Virginia is right at the epicenter of this whole discussion. Are we going to ensure and guarantee the franchise for every eligible voter in this country? And I said, let's live up to our history. Let's live up to what we have been all the years. It's this beacon of hope and light, literally this transition between the North and the South. And I think depending on where this goes, it might kind of settle what the fate, where was West Virginia this critical hour in this nation's debate and discussion over whether or not every citizen will be treated equally and fairly, because it's my humble opinion that the most powerful, the most significant, and the most important expression of our citizenship is the right to the franchise, is the right to the ballot. The only place in the United States of America that there's true equality, no other place. In that ballot box, every man and every woman that's 18 years of age or above and who still have their right to the franchise, their vote is one vote like everybody else. And that's why I'm so passionate about it and feel so strongly about the fact that we have an opportunity at this hour with people from our state at the national level to settle the matter once and for all. So to me, we're fighting the Civil War in West Virginia. And the South won. The South has won. I just come to tell you that the South has won, that we have effectively been reconnected with the Confederacy in terms of our approach to policy, our stance on voting rights, our stance on the teaching of history in school, whether or not we're going to teach true history or not, that we have reunited with the Confederacy. But what people understand, this happened a long time ago. They think this is something new. The Union in the North won the Civil War, and the people of West Virginia was on the winning side. But the Southerners, the Virginia Commonwealth people, they won the peace, and most people don't realize that. That after the Civil War was over, because there was about the same number of people, as I said earlier, were divided, whether we succeed or whether we stay, about 29,000 men fought for the Union, about 29,000 fought for the Confederacy. It was almost equally divided. But what people fail to realize is after the war was over, the people that were pro-Confederacy, they seized control of the politics. And that's why the Capitals moved from Wheeling to Charleston. They took control of the politics. You go back and look at the history very closely. And they immediately started to reconnect West Virginia with the Confederacy. When the Southern women, the daughters of the Confederacy, you check the record, in about 1910, they have this parade with hundreds of women dressed in their white outfits and so forth, and they marched down the Canal Boulevard for the dedication of the statue to Thomas Stonewall Jackson on the grounds of the Capitol. And Stonewall Jackson from Clarksburg had fought vigorously against West Virginia becoming a state, had fought certainly on the side of the Confederacy. And so just after, in the early 1900s, this connection was already happening. There wasn't a statue to Lincoln until a long time after that. There wasn't a statue to the soldiers that fought for the North a long time after that. So the Confederates, they won the peace in West Virginia. And for the most part, people accepted it. And in all practical we kind of reconnected with the South. But because Black people were such a small part of the population, they were never viewed as any threat in West Virginia. So we didn't have this blatant, aggressive, terroristic Ku Klux Klan. I called it a quieter and a gentler Ku Klux Klan, right? Everybody knew it was there, right? And growing up as a young Black boy, I mean, we knew our place. We knew our place in the society. And I want someone to correct me, but when I was a boy, I did not know a single Black person that lived in Oak Hill. Now, somebody can correct me, but in the 1960s, I did not personally know a single Black person that lived in Oak Hill. They would say, I'm from Oak Hill. There's some Harlem Heights, there's some Whipple, there's a Minden number 2, there's some Scarborough. They weren't living in Oak Hill proper. I didn't know a single person. There may have been some, I didn't know a single white person, a Black person that lived in Oak Hill when I grew up as a boy. And growing up in Mount Hope, our community was segregated. There are a few little pockets where we lived. I went to segregated school. I started school in 1962. That's 8 years after Brown versus the Board of Education. But I started school at W. Doors Elementary School, up Kessler's Holler, little school inside the hill, and went to that school until 1966. And when we moved up from McDonald Hill to the project up in Stadium Terrace, and I had my favorite toy there, it was a commode. I hadn't saw many of them, right? Inside plumbing and toiletry. The school bus would go to PAX, because when they was closing the schools there, they had to bring those children to Mount Hope. And they would stop in the Stadium Terrace and they would pick us up. So we would get on the bus and come down to Mount Hope and then go up on the hill to Mount Hope Elementary School. It's a beautiful brick school, playground, basketball court, indoor gymnasium. And they would get off. We would get back on the bus and they would take us down the hill and round the way and up Kessler's Holler. And we would get off, we'd go to this little 4-room school on the side of the hill. We didn't even have a swing set. Oh, it was a merry-go-round and a dirt turnaround to turn around in. And so it's kind of obvious to me that this is not equal. It's separate, but it's certainly not equal. And we literally would get the books that came from the Board of Education after the school, the Caucasian school got the new books. And that was just kind of life growing up. And I remember we would go to the movie theater. You couldn't be uptown after dark. People tell all these stories about the nostalgia of West Virginia, of Mount Hope. I'm telling you the truth. We would go to the movies, if we went on Friday or Saturday, we'd go in a large group. And we thought we had the protection of the group. Otherwise, we'd go on Sunday afternoon after church. And I always delivered newspapers. And I would get up early in the morning, and most of my route was uptown. I had Okiel Patterson, the former governor, Dr. Hodge, who's the doctor who birthed me, big mansion, I don't know who lives in it now. Miss Graney, who owned the Bank of Mount Hope. You're gonna realize that. One of the richest families at the time was the Graney family. and the matriarch, she was one of our cousins and others. And but in the evenings, at the end of the month, when I have to collect, I would write them a note and say, if you could put the money, $2.15, that's what it costs for a month, 7 days a week, get the back to post arrow, just put it in an envelope and put it under your doormat. Because I didn't want to come back in the evenings, you know, to have to run and be rocked and that type of thing. This happened. This is not in my head. And then people come out and cheer for me when I played sports. So in our little community, we didn't really deal with white people that much. It might be hard for people to tell, but no, it's not the case. We played at Mount Hope Elementary School. After school, we were allowed to go on that place and play. And the whites would almost never come up there. And in that little community, I, for the most part, only had Black friends, except for the Romages. The Romage family lived right down below the school. And John and Victor, they would come on the court and they would play with us. Mr. Romage, he worked for the bottling company, and he was always giving us soda pop because he was just a real nice gentleman. But that's just, it wasn't hostility, it's just that there was an acceptance. We're here and y'all over there. And so there wasn't much interaction until you got into junior high, when the schools were first desegregated at that level. That's just kind of a history about my own personal experience. And so my family's experience is like many people that's in West Virginia. My great-grandfather was born on a slave plantation in Goochland County, Virginia. This is just on this side of Richmond. Before you get to Richmond County, it's Goochland County. And he was there, and he had 4 or 5 sons. And after slavery was over and ended, they were trying to get out of the Virginia Commonwealth. And so they left because they'd heard about the black gold in the ground in southern West Virginia. And they made the migration from Goochland County, and they'd heard about job openings in Fayette County, and that's where they settled. And my grandfather settled right there in a place called Turkey Knob. And that's where he lived with his family. And my father, he lived about, before you get into Turkey Knob, right when you turn to go to Turkey Knob. So my father never left within a quarter mile from where he was born, where his father had settled, except to go to the service and come back to Mount Hope and go into the coal mine. So my grandfather was a coal miner. Of course, he died very early, his 50s, from black lung, silicosis, all those other complications. My father, he was a coal miner's coal miner. I mean, he loved it. That's all he talked about. He could run every machine in there. He took great pride in being able to go in that coal mine and mine that coal and get to it and so forth. And of course, he too died of a black lung. Lived a fairly long life, but it was painful to watch him just disintegrate in terms of his lung was being choked out. So my mom, she didn't want her sons to go in the coal mine. It's a true story. And so to convince me that I was claustrophobic, back then you didn't have self-defrosted refrigerators. Now we always had a refrigerator. We didn't have ice, but we always had a refrigerator, right? We had electricity. You have to defrost it every so often. My mother would defrost the refrigerator, she would clean it out. And she said, "You want to know what it's like to be in the coal mine?" I said, "Yeah, I want to know what it's like to be in the coal." She said, "Get the refrigerator." So I got it, she shut the door. She shut the door, traumatized me. And she said, "You go in the coal mine, your light go out. That's what it's gonna be." And so she convinced me I was claustrophobic. And I was determined, Brother Smallwood, by hook, by crook, whatever necessary, I wasn't going underground. Because my mama would always say, if God meant for coal to be mine, he would put it on top of it. So for us claustrophobics. And so that's kind of a bit of my story and a bit of the history. So the struggle and the pain of being Black in West Virginia. And part of that pain comes with feeling like you're never fully accepted. No matter how hard you work, no matter how much you study, no matter how qualified you try to be, that there's still a certain disdain. Because if you become a self-taught intellectual, then you become an uppity. And that's what they say about me. He's an uppity, right? If they knew how I was raised, they would better understand. My mama was an alcoholic. She had 7 children. She worked her fingers to the bone, died when she was 48, but loved us to death. And my grandmother helped to raise us. And they instilled in us a vision of being significant. My grandmother made me feel like when I got up in the morning, the sun rose. And it set when it's time for me to lay down. And so no one could convince me otherwise. So my self-esteem was never held by the fragile thread of Caucasian people. I didn't care what they said. It didn't matter, right? Because my sense of value and worth came from my mother and my grandmother and from my siblings, and the fact that we believed that God had put us here and we had the right to breathe the air, to walk on the ground and not apologize for it. And that we could compete anywhere that we were allowed to compete, whether it's academically, whether it's athletically, whether it's intellectually, that we could compete because we want to put in the work and we want to put in the effort. So I had a bank account ever since I was 6. I carried grit newspapers, knocked on people's doors all over West Mount Hope, looked pitiful. They take me out in the orchard, Mr. Robinson, I pick berries, right? My grandmother opened me an account when I was 6. She said, every man should have a nickel in his pocket, she would say, to keep the hanks off of you. I never knew what the hanks was, Larry, but she would talk about the hanks so bad, I just knew I didn't want them on me, right? So I didn't want the hanks to be on whatever they were. Right? So those are things that kind of instilled in me. So to bring this little presentation to a close, I've given you something I would hope you take home and really read it and study it. The 1 2-page document, 2 days of apathetic indifference and neglect. And what it does, it chronicles my involvement with West Virginia legislature over the last 20 years. I've been going there for 23 years. I don't intend to go back. But I did that as a case to say, is this as bad as I think it is? Are these people as indifferent to Black people as I think they are, and to poor people as I really think they are? So I felt like I've got to be persistent and I've got to be there and I got to engage in the process because I can't criticize or critique it unless I've actually tried to see if I could do something to help it to be a good, solid citizen. And so the first couple of years, I didn't even know what was going on down there. But then I kind of figured it out, talked to a few people, and that's when we began to realize if you're going to change systems, you got to change policies. And we worked with some legislators, and I figured out I can do this. I mean, I can write up a bill, and then they'll give it to the bill drafter. They'll put it in the language. And so on this sheet of paper, there are probably 18 bills that I was involved in, and probably more like 10 of them that I actually wrote the draft for them. And for the most part, these bills have been ignored. They have been, many of them written and passed, codified in law, and not executed. And nobody said anything. Nobody said anything about it. Just not, and then I begin to realize the whole system is rigged. It's a rigged system. We don't have 3 equal branches of government. The judicial branch is pretty powerful, right? And them judges, man, they like gods. The magistrates, they got some real cachet. They got some power. But in our state, the legislative branch is not equal to the executive branch. The legislative branch bends to the executive branch, right? We do not have a true democracy, not at the state level. It doesn't matter what's Democrat or Republican. Currently, we got a situation where everybody's afraid of the executive. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. That both parties are afraid of the person who sits in the executive seat. And we're going to get bad policy, and we're getting bad policy, and we're going to see how bad it is after all this money is gone. So we've been propped up now by all the $1.25 billion in CARES Act funds, $1.335 billion to the state level in American Rescue Fund. Another $800 million came to the school board, which has gone to the state and gone to local school boards. You know, another 800, 900 billion has been distributed to the county and city government. We got so much money, they can't even spend it all. But when it's gone, then we're going to be in much worse shape than we were before because I don't see a coherent plan that has been developed or that has been executed to really make sure these monies are spent in the right way. So I encourage you to take a look at this right here. You might find it somewhat enlightening, because the bills that we worked on wasn't just for Black people. And that's another thing that's painful. They're going to typecast you and say you can only talk for Black people. I say, wait a minute, I'm a human being, right? And poor white people and poor Black people face the same real dilemma in this state, and always have faced a similar dilemma ever since the Southern West Virginia coal fields, ever since the mine war. They were trapped in the same situation. But that the white elite has always been able to manage and control the masses of low income and low wealth people by sowing division and getting them to realize that they can't work together. And they don't work together, therefore they never have any political power to really move the system. But I think this might be something like. Last thing I want to share a little bit about is we wrote a letter to the governor and the legislative leadership about a year and a half ago when the $1.25 billion CARES Act money came through. And what we suggested that 20% of that money should be set aside to fund projects in the most distressed areas in the state. We called it the 20-20-20 Economic Justice and Equity Fund. 20% of the money, $250 million, invested in the census tract of poverty rates 20% or higher. There's roughly 240 census tracts in West Virginia have poverty rates 20% or higher, 20% or higher. And that would have been consistent with the federal tax legislation of 2018 that created the opportunity zones. And the opportunity zones had to have poverty rates 20% or higher. And they wouldn't even respond to us. Even though the Charleston Gazette, I give them credit, the editorial board, they wrote a pretty impressive editorial that was an excellent idea. And they strongly encouraged the governor to support that. Ms. Susan Williams, who used to write for the Gazette, I think she lives now in Fayette County, and she wrote an op-ed piece to support it, but nothing happened. A few weeks ago, and I'd be more than glad to send this if y'all are interested, we wrote a letter to the governor, the WE group I work with called the Tuesday Morning Group, and basically we took some of these bills, right? Bills dealing with areas of health, housing, education, employment, economic and workforce development. It's okay, why don't you use these bills as a framework? So here's a framework that we're going to use to make sure that we expend some of the CARES Act money, or I should say the ARPA money, the American Rescue Plan Act money, wisely and effectively. And we said those bills then could be used by the county and the cities to do a similar thing, and they could align some of the funds. Those are some of the bills you worked on, Senator Laird. The one bill, the Senate Bill 611 in 2012, and it was reauthorized in 2017 as a House Bill 2188, but it would have created a special community-based project to improve outcomes for at-risk youth by creating clearinghouses to coordinate all the social services, improve effectiveness and efficiency to try to get more money out of it. And so that was one of the bills. Another bill you worked on was House Bill 2950, the Neighborhood Housing Economic Stabilization Bill. And it was to fund housing projects in distressed areas, to use housing, rehab, upgrades, maintenance, new construction, and weatherization as an economic development driver to put skills in the hands of young men and young women, and also create better housing stock. They wouldn't even respond to it. And some of you may have saw the big front page article in Charleston Gazette newspaper a couple of weeks ago, where Joe Severino wrote an article about it. And so finally the governor's office have responded to the letter, but they didn't respond to the letter. It's a run-on narrative about all the things they're working on. They didn't respond specifically to what we submitted. So I don't know if he gave you this stuff, but I want you to see this here. This will go out Monday, right? It's on my computer. I just got to prove it for the last time. And then we're talking with specifics. And we're saying that, let me tell you something you might not know. They received $677 million at the state level, $677 million of the $1.335 billion that's coming to the state. They've already got $77 million. They've already spent $400 million of that. And some of that went to New Corps, We got to give these people money to bring these companies in. They spent 400 million of that. So it means only 277 million left. So the state is saying that the governor's office will submit his recommendation to the legislature. The legislature will then allocate the money. So what we've allocated here is a $77 million request, basically saying that money should be set aside to fund projects in these areas, right? We've got to invest in the people. We've got to invest in the place where they live. And so I close with this. If we let them just do what they want to do without at least letting our voices be known, shame on us. We the people. This money, every penny of it, belongs to the people, not to Jim Justice, not to the Washington legislature, not to the Fayette County Commission, not to the city of Oak Hill, not to the Fayette County school system. We got so much money in Kanawha County, it should be sinful. The Kanawha County Commission got 36 million. The city of Charleston got 37 million. The Kanawha County School Board got $82 million. That's just in that one county. And that's not including what South Charleston got, what Dunbar got, what Nitro got, what these other little small municipalities received. And that's what was not fair. The money that went to these smaller little places that have more distress, got greater needs, I believe they should have gotten more than the allocation they got based on the census, because my little community only got 120, 30-some thousand in Mount Hope. They can't even replace the water line that ran to my house, right? We drunk brown water for years, right? I think it did me good. Cleaned up my arteries. But actually take a look at this, and we just ask people to be responsible citizens. If they think it's a good idea, contact the governor's office, encourage them to seriously consider this. It would create funds that every community would have an opportunity to possibly get some funds to fund the project. Well, I'm out of my time. I thank you for yours. I'm going back to take just a couple of questions because I don't want to keep you guys over. But if anyone have a question or comment, I'll be more than welcome. So you're more than welcome. I appreciate it. Anyone else? What should imagine basically what he's saying, and I hear what he's saying, and I understand what he's saying. He's talked about this is a major piece of legislation, and everybody would agree it is. And he's saying that if we just pass this legislation on a partisan basis, no bipartisanship, no Republicans coming over, then we're setting ourselves up that when Republicans have a slim majority, they'll do the same thing. And to him, I said, we know what they're going to do. They are showing us what they're going to do. They've showed us in the past what they're going to do. But no disrespect meant toward Republicans. What I try to say to him is that you are elevating the filibuster, which is a procedure, a legislative procedure, and you putting it on the same level as the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That's what is troubling to me. And you participated in writing a bill, but not a single Republican could you persuade to sign on to. So, in all due respect to the senator, he keeps saying we're going to work on it, we're going to get it done. And my response is, my concern is you just trapped in the paralysis of political analysis. You don't understand that this is going to tear our republic apart, because the way many Black people feel is that we're supposed to get the franchise in 1870 with the 15th Amendment. And we had it for just a few years, and Reconstruction ended, and the Southern states took it away. The poll tax, the literacy test with oppression. So by the time you get to 1960, there's only a fraction of Black people voting, even registered to vote, in states like Mississippi. So we got to go through a second process to get another piece of federal legislation passed. In 1965, the Voters' Rights Act. And what it does is to basically to ensure what the 15th Amendment is supposed to do, right? We got to go through this again, 90-some years later. So now here we are in 2020. And you tell us the 15th Amendment and the 65 Voters' Rights Act and Robert's Supreme Court gutted the 65 Voters' Rights Act with the Shelby decision versus Holder, when they eliminate pre-clearance and basically gutted the 65 Rights Act, and immediately many states start to pass these laws to make it difficult for people to vote. And that's all I'm trying to get the Senate to realize, that if you have to go with a one vote margin majority to protect the franchise of millions of people, that's what you really need to do. Otherwise, history is not going to be kind to you. It's not going to be kind. And I fear that that's what they're going to do. And I think that we're going to see riots in the streets like we've never seen before. We don't have Martin Luther King. We don't have Martin Luther King, and we don't have a common voice to tamp down some of the frustration and some of the anger that exists. And so we went through the George Floyd situation. We went through all these situations. And now you're going to tell people, well, we don't care if your vote is right, protected or not. So this is the type of conversation we've had. I haven't come out harshly criticizing them because I don't think it's effective, right? But I've tried to be reasonable to say, look, understand what the stakes are for this country, not West Virginia, for the country. Because in West Virginia, for the most part, people have access to the ballot. I don't like to see them cutting down on the early vote and all those type of things, but still, we can get people to the ballot. We can get people an ID. Okay, I understand. But anyway, that's the conversation we've had. I hope to talk to him while he's home this time. One more? Anyone? Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Anytime y'all in Charleston, look me up. I'm easy to find. Everybody got my cell number.
In 2020, Rev Matthew Watts, the first African American Democratic state. He spoke then about using the CARES Act. He had a plan then. He called it 20-20-20. He wanted 20% of that money set back 20% of our poorest money. White and white. 20-20-20. I was just going to ask you, that's been 2 years. Now you're off of the CARES Act money because this is have you had any traction on your American Rescue Plan? Or you've been, this is a 2 years of dedicated work on. Let's watch that money. And I'm wondering where you feel you're at right now.
Unfortunately, we just haven't had a lot of traction with it. But we're planning one more day at the Capitol. And so we're going to try to get the date nailed down next week. And it will probably be the following week, the last day of the legislative session, to try to get people to participate in a letter writing campaign to the governor, to House Speaker Roger Henshaw, to Senate President Craig Blair, and to the chairs of the House and Senate finance committees. That's where the power rests, right? But I believe that we could influence it, but there has to be a groundswell of support. I mean, people have got to be writing letters to the governor's office. They got to be calling the governor's office, and they need to be calling their elected officials, particularly if they're on the Republican side. I'm just being honest with you. The Democrats have no votes. They have no standing. So the Republicans are going to determine how the money is spent, particularly the finance committees. And I think what we try to give is a template and a guide to say what is unreasonable about what we're saying, right? What is unreasonable about setting aside some of this money, as you see on the list there, for housing projects, right? Projects to make the workforce investment system more accessible. Right now, you got to go to, is there one in Fayetteville? You got to go to Beck. Come on, people. You mean to tell me in Fayette County there couldn't be a satellite center? That's what we call for a satellite center so people can get signed up with the workforce. Please, Madam Secretary, read over that. If you go to my Facebook page, you actually can send the governor an email or call him right from my Facebook page. I have a posting out there with this on it. I stumbled on it. I don't know how I got it. I was just posting something on Facebook and some kind of way it came up and said, okay, you can, and I did with the governor's picture at the bottom. So I hope somebody can teach me how to do it, but it's there. And you can send them an email. The last thing I want to say is this. I tell my friends all the time, they get angry with me when I say this. I say to them, voting is overrated if that's all you do. If all you do is vote, it's overrated. You give a person your franchise, you give them your confidence and your trust, and then they take it and they go down to Charleston. And they got other people talking to them in their ear. They forget all about you. They don't know you exist. They really do. And not intentionally. It's just that everybody else is in their ear, you have to be in their ear. And I think if we get in the ear of the legislators from Fayette County, y'all got some powerful people down in the legislature from Fayette County now, right? They're powerful. You got some powerful Republicans down in the Capitol. Get in their ear. Say, why not this plan? Why not this plan right here? We're not going to waste the money. I think that we could tilt this. I really do. And that's what we're going to try to do. We're trying to speak to people, post on Facebook, get people to take a look at that. Would it not help Fayette County? Is there not places where you need to create some more safe, affordable, energy efficient housing that's not public housing, right? Access to a workforce development system where people can get to it, sign up for unemployment, get registered for jobs, to get into the one-stop system. Those are the type of things we're calling for there. We're not talking about giving people a check or giving people money. We're talking about creating an apparatus to help people access the opportunity that it's funded by the federal government, but we're not taking full use of it. And I think we might be able to move them, but it's going to have to be a groundswell of calls to the governor's office, because the legislator's going to do pretty much what he tells them, right? I talked to Ann early. I mean, she's a pretty powerful lady in the governor's office. She's a deputy chief of staff. And this is what she said. Now, I'm not telling you what somebody told me. If we spent $400 million of the $677 million, we've got $277 million left. The governor knows how he wants to spend the money, and he's going to submit his recommendation to the legislature. They may go ahead and budget this money when they get to the end of the cycle, when they do the budget bill. Senator Laird knows about that process. Or he may just call them back in for special session or keep them there for special session day or two to deal with the $277 million. So it's still time, right? They just need to hear from citizens. And you might have other ideas. Here's the last thing I want to tell you. Ann Early is talking to me on the phone, on Zoom. And she says she picked up a stack of papers. She said, I got $200 billion in requests for the American Rescue Plan Act. I said, what? She said, I have $200 billion. I said, where'd they come from? She said, they've come from all over. Now, there's no process. There's no RFP. There's no application online. But their close friends are aware that we can submit our request in to the governor and we could get considered for funding. And that's, once I had the conversation, I said, well, I'm going to write up a list of things and send it to them. Not for me personally, but things that could help communities. I just believe we've got, there has to be a coalition of people, both sides of the political aisle, that's concerned about the most challenged people in their area. They're not going to disappear. They're not going to go away. If we don't figure out how to try to help them now, the state has $1 billion surplus because they've been underestimating revenues. I believe intentionally to create this surplus. So $1 billion state surplus, plus all this money from the federal government. If we're not going to do something to help the most distressed communities now, I don't know when we'll ever do it. And the last thing I would actually be thinking about, and we're getting ready to have another conversation. We met this county superintendent 3 times. He has 82 million. 12 million he set aside for PPE. Okay, I get that. Cleanup, I get that. 24 million, they want to upgrade the HVAC system. You got to move more air, right? It's what I said, it's unhealthy, you know, kids got asthma. I get that. Keep the kids healthy, everybody can breathe. They leave 45 million. That he says is going to be for academic recovery and innovation. So all I'm saying to him is, can't you take maybe 10% of that, fund every after-school program in Kanawha County, give all of them some money. They try to help these kids in the evenings, on weekends. They try to work these kids during the summer. They do it on shoestring budgets. It would encourage them and give them some more resources to do something. Is that unreasonable? I don't think it's unreasonable. If you don't want to go 10%, 4.5%, but you just can't spend it all and the people get nothing, no consideration. So that's, I feel so strongly about this. This is the time in history that if the people don't speak up and let their voices be known to their elected leaders, then I think that they're going to just really continue to ignore the people. And as I think it was Orwell that said that when the people fear the politicians, you get tyranny. That's what you got in Russia right now. When the politicians fear the people, you get a republic. They have no fear of us, none. Write them a letter. Most of them will just ignore it. Write the governor, I guarantee they don't respond to it. But if enough people write letters, there's a ground full of support. I think we can move them. And if we move them here to do something that they wouldn't do ordinarily, it shows the power of the people. Thank you.
Well, folks, that concludes our Black History Month celebration sponsored by the city of Oak Hill. We've had a speaker every single Saturday in the month of February at 6 o'clock to talk something about the Black experience in the American experience. And I think that that's been worthwhile. This is the first time that's ever been done in Oak Hill. And by the way, we did make NPR about this. NPR talked about Oak Hill, West Virginia having this series. So we made that. And when Reverend English was here the week before, Reverend English asked us, he said he never heard such a thing before anywhere in West Virginia. And he thought he was very shocked. It came from a town of this size. He was expecting, if it did happen, be a much bigger city. So he was really impressed that Oak Hill took the lead in this. So I'm happy all the way around. Anytime Oak Hill makes the news, it's good for Fayette County. It's good for Fayette County anytime Oak Hill makes the news. So thank you all for showing up. Thank you for taking part. And thank you for Reverend Watts, his dynamic comments regarding the struggles and pain of being Black in West Virginia. And next year, we'll see if we can do something else, and maybe even, I don't know if it's being better or not, but we'll try to do something else. Thank you.